Hey everyone, it's Grayson here with my friend Aden. So today we are going to be discussing whether or not there is compelling evidence that would cause one to accept the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this is kind of a fun and in-depth concept or topic for debate. We wanted to structure it this way so that we could focus on just the resurrection, not so much atheism versus Christianity, but just looking at what is the historical evidence or what is the reasons why one might accept that Jesus Christ, in fact, rose from the dead, as that seems to be, at least I would say, is the central claim of Christianity. um, so yeah, without, I guess I'll just say that um, my stance, I think, is probably pretty obvious to a lot of the listeners that I do not find that the evidence that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead is compelling or sufficient for me to believe that it really happened. So we're going to be kind of just structuring this as a more informal conversation. We're not going to be presenting openings and rebuttals and all that. So yes, Maya, this is live. Um, and yes, Captain Desk, it is kind of obvious which side I would argue from. So I would like to pass it over to Aiden to sort of walk us through maybe what his thinking is about this evidence and what are his reasons that he finds it compelling or sufficient to believe that it really happened. Um, so Aiden, without ado, if you could maybe introduce yourself to the audience that doesn't know you and kind of start walking us through your rationale.
Yeah, so hi, my name's Aden Jones. I'm a Christian, obviously, and I do believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a historical event that we can say happened in history. Now, I don't claim to be able to know this with 100% certainty or anything like that, but I fundamentally don't believe in 100% certainty. I believe that when it comes to basically anything, you have to go with like whatever the answer is, the most likely answer that explains all the evidence, and that goes with everything. And I find that when it comes to these sorts of things, this sort of discussion, it tends to come down to um, like your views on naturalism versus supernaturalism, however you want to define that sort of thing. Because with the with the evidence that the historical scholars go through, there does seem to be evidence that like really lines up with the idea that Jesus Christ resurrected. But of course, if you believe in a naturalistic worldview or a materialist worldview where such a thing is just impossible from the outset, you're obviously not going to grant that a lot of credence. So I guess it is going to come down to that. Um, so should I just sort of give like a layout of like all the sort of facts that the scholars are working with, and then sort of go from there, or?
Sure, that might be a good way of going forward. Maybe if we can, do you know like roughly like how many facts that you see? And you're saying that these are the facts that align more with the resurrection app actually happening than any other explanation?
I just meant in terms of like the facts that are sort of that are like agreed upon with scholars, and then some of the stuff that's like in contention, like
Okay.
for example,
Yeah.
whether or not Jesus was buried. Yeah. So I have here in front of me, it's a historical paper written by a secular historian, who's sort of goes is sort of looking at the arguments from both sides, and basically uh, to give a rundown of this paper and to give a rundown of many other sort of accounts of this argument. The stuff that an overwhelming amount of scholars agree on, whether they're secular or not, they agree that Jesus Christ existed, that he was baptized by John the Baptist, that he believed he was the Messiah. He had 12 apostles who also believed he was the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and then whether or not he was buried in a tomb, there's some contention there, or whether he was just sort of thrown in a pit. That's one of the points of contention. Um, and then obviously, and another thing that is pretty overwhelmingly accepted by a lot of scholars is that the 12 apostles genuinely, authentically believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, whether or not they were mistaken, or whether or not they were like correct and like Jesus did actually raise from the dead. Um, and so I can go into all the evidence as to why that is, but that pretty much really is the what the debate comes down to is either they actually saw the resurrection, or not the resurrection itself, but they saw the risen Christ, or they had a series of either mass hallucinations or false memories, which
Mhm.
led them to authentically believe, mistakenly, however, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Those are kind of the two main options. There are
Okay.
other ways, things you could believe, but those are the two main camps.
So personally, I am not a mythicist. I know that there are lots of Jesus mythicists out there that would claim that there isn't historical evidence that Jesus even was a real person who existed. I'm not personally one of them. I do agree with you that the vast majority of the field that would be relevant to this topic would agree on, at least I'd say would agree on most of those basic facts. I don't have an issue with the sake of this argument as of for just conceding all of those facts. I don't think that that if those facts being real in any way harms my position, because my position would basically be that, if we were to accept that those facts by themselves are sufficient evidence that Jesus Christ was resurrected, then there's a whole lot of other historical claims that we would then have to also accept, like the claims of Mormonism and Joseph Smith, the claims of, Haitian witch doctors or cult leaders like the Branch Davidians or during the Taiping Rebellion. I mean, I can just name a lot of historical examples that I would see as having a similar strength of evidence from the historical facts listed so far. So maybe we can get into those, or what is it that makes this set of facts for the resurrection compelling enough to believe its supernatural claims, and why all the other instances of historical evidence that has supernatural claims should not be believed in comparison. So that's kind of what my stance is.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I suppose we could like we could go into the details of like comparing different supernatural claims with different people. Um, with the case of I could say, for example, like with the Joseph Smith thing, because I'm familiar with that, because I know people who are Mormons, or they
Mhm,
prefer the term Latter Day Saints and that sort of thing. Um, like I know that the story is that like Joseph Smith actually saw God and Jesus like come down from heaven or something. And but the thing is that only according to that idea, that only one person saw it, and then the rest of them, they just believe that he saw it. Which means it is possible that one person could have just had a bit having a hallucination or have lied. It gets a bit more difficult when you have the case of Jesus Christ, because there was more than one person that reportedly had seen um,
okay.
the risen. Yeah, so
So
apparently there was not just the 12 apostles, there was the women that first saw him, and also Paul the apostle. I think there's like a list of like 500 different people that saw the
mhm.
resurrection.
So
Well, not the resurrection, but saw Christ incarnate in some way.
So on this, I would kind of have to push back a little bit in two different ways. One, I would push back that we really have these eyewitness testimonies for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Like, I would say that similarly, the consensus in the field of biblical scholarship is not that these four gospels were written by the apostles themselves. And it might say in the gospel that there were 500 witnesses, but we don't have any firsthand accounts from any of these 500. So that would just be, I don't know if I would grant that any of these are eyewitness testimonies. And then the other prong that I would push back with is that there are other historical claims of supernatural occurrences that do have multiple witnesses. I mean, just with the Mormonism example, there are, like, contrary to the Gospels or the early Christian writings, we do have like signed affidavits of eyewitnesses for some of the claims in Mormonism. There are at least three that I'm aware of that have like signed eyewitness, legal affidavits. But there's more than that with like the Marian apparitions, where people have seen the Virgin Mary. There are, group witnesses of the Virgin Mary for like large groups of people. Um, my favorite is Our Lady of Lavang, I think, which is a Vietnamese account of like a large group of people that witnessed the Virgin Mary appearing with two angels, and she was dressed in Vietnam traditional Vietnamese dress, which I think is an interesting detail for a Vietnamese Virgin Mary appearing. And this was to a large group of villagers. There's also Our Lady of Fatima, which was in Portugal, where she appeared to, tens of thousands of people, or at least there was a supernatural witness that was prophesied to be from the Virgin Mary on that day, and it was witnessed by tens of thousands of people. So I think that you can have these kind of group witnesses for these, supernatural claims in history, but I'm not a Mormon, I'm not a Catholic. I don't accept that these people were really seeing what they thought that they were seeing. So I just see in terms of the group witnesses. Sorry if this is kind of going on and rambling, but those are my two prongs. One, that we have other instances of group witnesses of supernatural events that I don't think either of us accepts. And then two, I question whether or not we really have eyewitness accounts for this Christian claim.
Well, in terms of the question of whether or not we do have eyewitness accounts, from what I understand of the scholarship, they do like overwhelmingly say that the Gospels might not have been written specifically by the eyewitnesses themselves, but that they were sort of there was a either an oral tradition which was dictated to the authors of whoever wrote the manuscripts,
Hmm.
um, or that uh, yeah, like that sort of thing. Whereas, I mean, it is possible that with some of the Gospels, it was actually just written by the person they say it was. Like I would say so with Luke, because it says in the beginning that what Luke was trying to do is he was trying to sort of go around and ask people questions and write an account of it, sort of thing. Like he was sort of trying to be a sort of early church historian himself. So we could say that he potentially had written Luke, but that's not necessarily the case with like Matthew or Mark or anything like that. Um, and the reason we have to believe that they are like eyewitness accounts, there's a couple of reasons. Well, ironically enough, it's like one of the things is that there's been noticed that there are many different there's differences in the accounts of the Gospels. Um, and some people would say that that's evidence against them, but ironically enough, it's actually evidence for them, because if they were exactly the same down to the letter, that would just be evidence of like a common source, like a singular common source, um, rather, or like a collusion, basically, or that it was edited to harmonize. That maybe the earliest manuscripts were conflicting, but they would have like edited it to make it similar in some way, but no effort was done to harmonize them in that sort of sense. And not to mention that when it comes to recalling eyewitness accounts, even in like court cases, people do tend to like remember different aspects of different details and like focus on different things. And that's just
Hmm.
sort of how human memory sort of works. Um, and so like they do end up in court cases finding it a bit suspicious if like a recount of like an eyewitness event by multiple witnesses is a little too coherent, like too like if they say the exact same thing with the same sort of wording, that's like evidence that they sort of colluded. Um, but yeah, I would say that uh, yeah, that Jesus would have like, because it is a sort of historical. It is historical to believe that Jesus had 12 apostles, and that those 12 apostles, I do believe they did witness these things, or at least in terms of like the actual resurrection themselves. The 12 apostles specifically wouldn't have directly witnessed the resurrection, but would have witnessed Jesus after the resurrection, sort of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of the idea that the writings that we have are eyewitness accounts. I mean, I don't think we're gonna get to the bottom of that one here, but yeah, I would accept the fact that they're based on an oral tradition, but obviously, oral traditions can somewhat vary in when they spread. Maybe certain parts are picked up here, certain parts are picked up there. I would be a little bit skeptical that we could say that we could establish that the oral tradition would go back to the apostles unchanged. between when it was started by the apostles and when it was written down in the gospels. I'd be very skeptical of that claim that there wasn't any additions or embellishments along the way. Um, and yeah, to my knowledge, there are like discrepancies between them. I don't think that that really establishes them as being more true or, I mean, yeah, I mean, I've heard the argument that it would be less true with the discrepancies. For example, what time of day was Jesus crucified during is one known discrepancy. But yeah, I don't think that helps your case that there are discrepancies. I know your example with the eyewitness testimonies matching perfectly, but yeah, to my knowledge, the synoptic gospels do share some word for word sections in them. So they were obviously aware of each other, um, and not totally independent sources anyway. So I don't know. I'm skeptical of these as being actual eyewitness documents. So I'm not sure that. Yeah, I just don't know exactly how this gets you to having a compelling reason to believe that this event really happened.
Well, so to in terms of like the compelling reasons to believe that it's actually happened. In terms of what again, I'm deferring to the historical consensus. The
Mhm.
historical consensus is that uh, I'm trying. I'm just trying to think about how to tackle this in terms of like, you know, not excuse me. Not only did the apostles sort of believe like because in terms of like how what happened, right? You have to have a certain theory that accounts for the evidence we do have and what actually happened, right? Um,
I don't
like
know if that's I would necessarily grant that, no, because there are other instances in history, like, where I wouldn't necessarily have an account of what really happened, like, with the the Marian apparitions, like, the Virgin Mary appearing to groups of people. I don't really have a working theory on what actually occurred. I'm just skeptical that what they claim that they saw was really what happened.
well, yeah, but in terms of like the historians, for example, they would be like particularly interested in providing an alternative account. Like we can't really sort of chalk it up to too much of a mystery because like if it is false, right, that Jesus didn't really resurrect, then one of
Mhm.
two options sort of presents itself. Either the apostles were mistaken, like they honestly did genuinely believe that they uh, saw the risen Christ, or that
Mhm.
they were lying intentionally.
Yep.
And the belief that they were lying intentionally doesn't tend to be very much favored by the consensus of historical scholars, not just because they died for their beliefs, but also because they would have very little motivation to sort of, make up the character of Christ or make up the resurrection when they could just, if they wanted, religious influence, for example, they could have very easily just claimed that they themselves came up with the teachings, and they would get more
Yeah,
glory for
the reason
themselves.
why I'm skeptical of that is because we do have so many examples of, like, cults and cult followers in, like, history that we could pull from where, you know, I mean, when you have a small group of religious followers and a religious leader that they view to be the savior, a lot of things can become very warped. I mean, a lot of cult followers are willing to follow their cult leader. Like there's doomsday cults that have mass suicides. I mean, they're certainly willing to die for their belief, and they're willing to warp their understanding of reality in order to fit their beliefs about this small religious movement. So, I mean, I can name lots of historical examples of religious cults that the followers were more than willing to die for their beliefs in their cult leader. Um, and I don't think that it's necessarily like, I don't see a huge issue with thinking that the apostles or the followers of Christ had a genuine belief that he was the Messiah or that he had resurrected in some way. And I also don't think that that's mutually exclusive with the stories being embellished over the decades. Um, and I see lots of history examples in history with like religious cults where it seems like something very much like that has happened before.
Well, in terms of religious cults, like if it is a sort of like they're sort of warping the facts in their head, what you don't tend to see is those same followers sort of getting dejected and sort of leaving the or like believing that like at any stage that it is in fact false. Like you sort of see them sort of stick like once they're convinced they sort of stick with it to the end sort of thing. They don't have like moments of like, oh, I guess it's not true kind of thing. And one of the things that is attested as also being historical, at least according to the paper I've got in front of me, is that it is considered historical that the apostles sort of felt dejected and they felt like that their religion essentially was a failure. They thought that because they didn't understand why Jesus was getting crucified, they didn't understand why
Hmm.
it was happening. They thought it was essentially a failure. They thought like once Jesus was dead, they were like, oh well, that's it, it's over. Pick up shop. We were wrong. And in terms of the idea of sort of reality warping, it, it that what you're describing would make sense if that didn't happen. If it was sort of like from the beginning, we're like, we know that this is all part of the plan, but they didn't think that. They were like, wow, we just kind of like we were
Hmm.
wrong. And that kind of acknowledgement doesn't tend to come in uh, at that level usually.
So I would actually reject that notion. There are plenty of instances in religious cults where they say, "Oh, the end of the world is going to occur on this date," and then that date passes, and then the prophet gets a new vision that, "Oh no, like it didn't happen for such and such reasons, and this is what's actually like." They adapt with changing circumstances. I think that there are plenty of like specifically some Mormon cults that have a long history of multiple of those events where they've always been able to adapt whenever their paradigm was shown to be off. So I don't think that, for a bunch of like the apostles or the followers of Christ that thought he was the Messiah, and then, oh, suddenly he's killed, and they're left with this option of either everything that I had believed was wrong, or that there was this other way in which they could have not been wrong, and that Jesus was still the Messiah, and that he's going to return again, and he's going to come back. I mean, I can see a very similar shift that occurs in a lot of religious cults like that whenever they're shown information to the contrary of what they thought was going to be the case.
But in the example that you provided with those doomsday cults, like they say the end world's going to end on this date or something.
Hmm.
What you don't tend to see is, oh, we were wrong, everybody go home, and then the guy comes back and says, actually, it was this other date, and then they all start coming back. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't
So
tend. It used to be tends to be like in the moment, like ad hoc,
yeah.
like where once you sort of leave a cult, I guess in that sense, you don't tend to go back, sort of thing.
So
Not from what I've seen anyway.
this kind of goes back to the idea of me being skeptical that these are eyewitness accounts, because it's very easy for me to see that that would be an important literary element, that you would want to establish this crisis of faith where all seems lost, and then this ray of hope comes in at the last minute. Jesus comes back, and you know it it seems like a reoccurring literary element that we see in lots of stories that could easily have been added for embellishment in order to convince people. Because I mean, when Christianity was first spreading, right, there were no gospels. There wasn't, at least that we know of, any written down information to convey to people. It was all word of mouth and all oral tradition that they were trying to convert other people to their side. So it's easy for me to see how these stories would have developed in terms of, you know, how efficacious they were at convincing other people or persuading them that Jesus really did rise from the dead. You would want to add those elements where people are doubting, they've lost their faith, they think it's all over because he died, and then he comes back, Gandalf on his white horse comes back to save the day at the end. I mean, it makes for a very good story. So again, my skepticism for the accuracy of these eyewitness testimonies is, I wouldn't necessarily concede that we know that there was this actual crisis of faith that occurred amongst the followers.
Well, I mean, in terms of whether or not what actually was a crisis of faith, I mean, like I would say that because the Gospels themselves, like you got to remember that if they're trying to do this is to sort of gain a religious following to preserve like what they believe, like it records that the apostle Peter um, denied Christ 3 times, for example. So he was sort of uh, losing faith, it seems, that, or at least he was scared of getting persecuted. But it seems like it could be one or the other. Um, but I don't know. I don't see it as like being a sort of a narrative tool because I mean I don't know. Like you can kind of sort of do that with like anything, right? Like I don't know, because there's some like if I was to use an example of like I don't know certain historical events where things did look like they seemed all lost and like then
Mhm.
things worked out. Like we do have historical events of things like that happening, I guess. Um,
Could you
like
name, like, maybe an example? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but, in my thinking, most of these historical examples would have other reasons beyond just one text to think that they really happened.
oh well, I mean, I'm just thinking. I'm just how do I explain
I
this?
don't mean to put you on the spot or whatever, but,
No,
because, like, again, and part of it is that there is a supernatural claim here, so a more mundane, natural claim, I think, has a lower standard of evidence required than a supernatural claim. Um, you know, extraordinary claims and evidence and all that.
well, I guess we could go into that a bit more because I think that sort of is what the argument sort of hinges on, right? Like it's obviously I think that the resurrection of Jesus is extraordinary, but obviously the term extraordinary is like a non-univocal term, and if we're taking the word extraordinary or supernatural or whatever as like a category, such that anything that fits into that category requires a different standard of evidence, well, we're going to need to make sure that's actually the case. Otherwise, we're just arbitrarily elevating the standard of evidence such that because like for example the line extraordinary crimes require extraordinary evidence. I mean, I agree with that, but then it sort of begs the question of what it means to be extraordinary because like with Matt Dillahunty, for example, you see him talk about this sort of thing. He doesn't actually have a standard of evidence which he knows like how to falsify in
Mhm.
terms of the resurrection. So like he himself doesn't know what it would look like for him to have the evidence that he would need. Um, and so I guess in order for this argument to sort of have a certain falsifiability to it, we would need to know what that standard is, and if it even should be
Yeah.
like I think obviously it should be a somewhat a different standard because resurrection events are different from other events that are more mundane. But black holes are also extraordinary, you could say.
Mhm.
But I wouldn't say they require a certain level of evidence. I guess a certain level of evidence that as what some people might treat it as supernatural event, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, so it is difficult to establish a supernatural event just with historical evidence alone because, I mean, if we imagine or ask what would be the ideal level of evidence for an event of a resurrection like this, um, 2,000 years ago, where we didn't have DNA testing or the kinds of advanced technology or recording devices that would be necessary maybe in a time like today. um, I would, if we I would certainly say that we would have a much stronger case if we had undeniable eyewitness testimonies from those 500 people. Like if we had 500 separate accounts all saying this, I would say, you definitely have it there. But at the same time, if we're just talking about eyewitness testimonies by themselves, we could look at something like in Haiti, where there are, voodoo witch doctor practitioners, where you could find right now, living today, you could find eyewitnesses to resurrections performed by witch doctors. Now, we have knowledge today that shows a little bit of how these witch doctors are doing this with like certain combinations of herbs and roots and things that can make it appear like you're dead, only for them to raise you up at your funeral and make it appear to all these witnesses that they have just resurrected somebody from the dead. But again, like, that's right now in 2023, we could go to Haiti and we could find a bunch of eyewitnesses to these resurrections. does that mean that what they really witnessed was what they believe that they witnessed? No, it doesn't. So I think that establishing supernatural claims based purely on eyewitness testimony is always going to be very difficult, and I'm going to be skeptical of it if all we have is eyewitness testimony. So that's why, even if we had eyewitness accounts from all of the 500 people, it would still, I would definitely say that they witnessed something. Something was witnessed, just like with the case with the Haitian witch doctors. Those people witnessed something that they believed was a resurrection. Um, but we would need more evidence to show that there wasn't a natural cause, like is the case with the voodoo witch doctors. And in this case, we don't even have what I would consider to be a single primary eyewitness account.
Well, in terms of like the Haitian witch doctors, that would be a good example of like, well, it's not just that like yes, we have the eyewitness accounts, but we can actually provide a reason why the eyewitness accounts appeared the way they did, right?
Mhm.
Because we know that he used the mixture of herbs and the roots and things like that. So we have that explanation that does account for the evidence, right? But in the case of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you don't have that explanation, that naturalistic explanation that does make account for all the evidence. So, for example, like obviously we know that Jesus wasn't just using herbs and roots because he was crucified, right? Like he was you know, tortured to death. He was scourged, whipped, hung up on a cross, pierced at his side. We know that because it says in the Gospels that when he was pierced in the side, blood and water came out. And they didn't know this at the time, but medically speaking, when you receive that kind of damage, there's sort of like a clear liquid, there's a sort of buildup that's like if you were stabbed, you would um, you know, spill blood or something that at least looks like blood and water. Um, so, um, so like medically, that sort of lines up, and it would be very odd that they'd be able to make up that detail again because they didn't know this at the time, medically. So we know that this person was like actually dead. It wasn't just apparent to die because when you were crucified, you died. It was a pretty effective way of killing people.
Mhm.
I would even say we also can establish historically that he was placed in a tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea, and they probably did place guards in front of that tomb. And you got to remember that at the time, the Jews who did not believe in the resurrection, because there was Jews that did and Jews that didn't. The Jews that didn't, all they would have had to have done to sort of falsify this religion and to prove that it's all bogus, in the same way the Haitian witch doctors did. All they would have to do is show Jesus' body in the tomb, lying there, and they'd go, "Hey, look, there he is." And then an alternative explanation is always going to be more likely because you have the evidence that it didn't happen. But they had to say like that the body was stolen because they could not show the tomb with his body in it. So an empty tomb by many historians for that reason is considered historical. So in terms of the evidence that we have to take, like any theory, whether it's supernatural or natural, is going to have to take into account the actual death of Jesus. Like he did die. The whole water thing with the fluid coming out of his side. Um, the tomb that he was placed in, the fact that it was found empty, and then of course after that you have all of these people that claim to have seen Jesus after the fact. So is it so here's an example, right? Is it impossible that each of these 500, or even if it was just 12, is it possible that each of these people were just having a mass hallucination? Of course it's possible, but you have to add on top of that possibility the fact that Jesus did die and that it is an empty body, an empty tomb without a body. Like, so when you add all of the evidence up together, it seems to skew things away from the likelihood that this was a natural thing versus towards, I guess, something you might nominally call a supernatural event.
Right. So, um, you said that the existence of the tomb was like there was reasons to believe that we know that there was this tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Um, what are your reasons for claiming that? Because one thing that I've always wondered, at least, is why it seems like the empty tomb would be one of the holiest like pilgrimage sites for early Christianity. So it's very strange to me that there wasn't like a tomb site until, like, I think it was Constantine's mother declared the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be the site of the tomb, but I don't think that many historians would accept that the Holy Sepulchre really is the tomb of Jesus. So why was it lost in like that's always just seemed weird to me. Something so significant as the empty tomb that people could point to and say, "Look, here's the tomb that was empty." It seems weird to me that it would be lost within the first couple hundred years of Christianity as it would continue to grow, and you'd think that there would be pilgrims that would want to come visit the empty tomb or something. I don't know. That's always just kind of not made sense to me. Um, but to my mind, it's not difficult to think like get most of the time when the Romans crucified a criminal, um, it's not like they were entombing them, like you said at the beginning, that there's some argument about whether or not they not just chucked him in a pit with the other criminals. Um, so I don't. I would just want to know what your explanation is for why you think that there's good reasons to believe that there really was a tomb beyond, that the Gospels say that there is.
Well, that's a good question. So the main reason, so to account for why, it's not a holy pilgrimage site that we know this is the place it happened. Well, one of the main reasons for that being the case, well, there's two main reasons. One of the main reasons is because a lot of the Christians who would have known where that tomb is would end up getting persecuted and murdered, basically. We know that an overwhelming majority of the apostles were killed. We know that an overwhelming of Jews in general would end up being killed in the destruction of the Second Temple.
Mhm.
So, like, you're going to have a lot of Jewish people dying, so a lot of uh, that sort of thing. And so a lot of the people who would know where this tomb is and know that it's like a holy site sort of thing and know which tomb out of all the tombs, um, they're gonna end up they're gonna end up losing that as a lot of people end up dying. Um,
But
Not to
wait,
mention,
Aiden, I don't mean to cut you off, but with the destruction of like the Second Temple and the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem at 70 AD, Christians were still permitted to live in Jerusalem, I believe, correct?
well, Christianity wasn't like at that point in 70 AD, it wasn't particularly well known, and I don't know the exact state of Christian persecution at that time, but I still believe that they were still being persecuted, like, because it wasn't just the Romans that were persecuting them; it was also um, pretty sure it was ordered by the Sanhedrin as well, by the Pharisees. So
Yeah,
they were
but
doing a
I
full.
mean, at that point, right? To my understanding, from the death of Jesus all the way through the modern day, there have always been, yeah, maybe like Saladin expunged some Christians, but then welcomed them back a little bit later. But for the most part, there have always been Christians in Jerusalem. There's never a time period where it would make sense that they would just suddenly forget or lose the sight of the empty tomb, um, because like there might have been like persecutions at certain times under certain Roman emperors, but like at 70 AD, whenever they kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem, I'm pretty sure that the Christians were still allowed to live there, and I don't necessarily buy that they would have lost the sight of. I mean, to my mind, I think that would be the holiest location in all of Christianity, right? The holy tomb.
Well, I guess to address that, you got to remember that at this early stage, especially before and a little bit after the destruction of the Second Temple, you couldn't really make a distinction the way we do in the modern day between what we would call Christians and Jews. They were sort of seen as just an offshoot of Jews, like it's like a sect within Judaism or a denomination, you could say. So they would have still been seen as Jews, and still
Um,
probably would have been similarly persecuted.
my
Um,
understanding is that in the early days of Christianity, there really were not that many Jewish converts, and that it was mostly Gentile converts. Like most of the new Christians that would make up the bulk of the people known as Christians were Gentiles, not Jews.
that's later. That's later in church history. Well, like it's early on, but like a little bit later than that certainly would have been the case. Not not exactly straight after the Second Temple, but somewhat after the Second Temple is where you start to see that shift. Probably around the time. Well, it would have been around the time that Paul the Apostle started coming in, which I
Yeah, but
think
that
was
was
before.
before 70 AD.
Yeah, that would have
I
been
mean,
before 70 AD, but like it would have taken time for the Gentile body to build up and
my
to
understanding was that there were very few Jewish converts to Christianity in those early days. So like most of the growth of Christianity throughout its entire history from the beginning to now was from Gentiles converting to Christianity and not from Jews being convinced, because as my understanding that the Jews did not accept that Jesus had fulfilled the prophecies for their Messiah. So they were not convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, and that the early converts to Christianity were not Jewish.
well, that's not exactly true. There were like a fair amount of Jewish converts in the early days, which is why you see there being a sort of controversy in the early church as to whether or not Christians need to be circumcised. There was a large
Mhm.
contingent of Jewish Christians
Yeah.
that were telling new Gentile converts that they need to be circumcised. And if that's just a small sect within Christianity, right, then obviously it wouldn't need to be addressed that hard. But like Paul the Apostle dedicates like pretty much an entire book, the book of the Galatians, practically to this
Yes.
one point.
So it was my
Um,
understanding that that side was largely represented by James, who would be an example of a Jewish convert after the death of Jesus, like James, the brother of Jesus. The only two examples that I can think of, at least, that are named are James and Paul for Jewish converts to Christianity. But you're right that James did have, more strict Jewish adherence to Christianity. Um, but I don't know how, if we could ever possibly get the numbers on this. I think that the reason why it's brought up by Paul is because James was highly regarded in the early church. So if you have one of the church leaders like James who's disagreeing with you like Paul, it makes sense that you would be addressing it.
I don't think it was James though. Like I don't think James was advocating for circumcision. I don't remember that being the
That was
case.
my
Like
understanding of it, but maybe I
usually
could
what
be correct
people
about that.
usually what people will say is that there's a seeming disagreement in terms of whether or not you are saved by works or whether you're saved by faith. Um, but like even in the book of James, I'm pretty sure there's a part where it talks about not we don't follow the old law, but rather we follow the law of liberty. I could try to find it if you like, but yeah, I'm pretty sure James was not a he wasn't trying to get people to follow the strictness of the old law. That we've been set free
That
by the
was
old law.
not
Like that
my
was
understanding of James, but, I'm willing to admit that if I'm incorrect about that, but, um, yeah, I think we maybe have gotten a little bit off into the reeds about whether or not, um, I'm okay with admitting that there was, or like conceding that there was a mix of converts. I would think that there were more Gentile converts. You might say that in the early days, maybe there were more Jewish converts. I don't know what the exact breakdown is. Um, but either way, I don't know how that gets us closer to being compelling evidence that the resurrection was a real event that happened or not, whether it was Jews that were converting to it or Gentiles. You know what I mean?
yeah, we should probably move to more because like basically the idea is that from what you were talking about before is you were asking why did the place where Jesus was buried not become this like super holy site. Um, and another thing you got to remember is there's two other things you have to remember is that from what I remember in the Gospels, he said he was buried at Golgotha or somebody thing which means place of the skull or something along those lines. And what that would have been is it would have been like a collection of like many tombs where like you'd bury like a lot of dead people. So it'd be hard to know, like, because you'd have like these whole sections, like whole mountains or something that were dedicated to just tombs,
Mhm.
and you'd bury like lots of different people in there. So Jesus probably would have been buried in like a tomb that would have had like other corpses in it. Like you would have had Jesus, and then you would have been buried next to maybe like Joe Schmo or something. Um, it depends on
Joe
what kind
Shlomo.
of tomb. Yeah, it depends on what kind of tomb Joseph of Arimathea bought, but it seemed to be at this place where there was like lots of tombs. So it'd be hard to pin down which exactly one. And it's also possible. I don't know this. This would be a gap in my knowledge, but it is also possible that you'd have multiple places called that, I think. Um, but I could be wrong about that.
So what were
So,
your
but
actual reasons? You said that there were good historical reasons to accept that there was like an empty tomb, I guess. So what were
okay.
those?
So the good historical reasons are, first of all, you have to understand the Jewish laws in terms of when you kill somebody and display their body, there's certain Jewish laws of what you're supposed to do. And there's a law in Deuteronomy that says that you have to take the body down before sunset. And you have to,
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure it also says you have to give it a burial. That is a law within Jewish scripture. And this law is not just in the Bible, but is also attested to by Josephus in the book Jewish Wars, where he does talk about, I'm pretty sure he talks about Jewish people getting crucified and receiving a burial. And we actually do also have archaeological evidence of people in tombs with like crucifixion spikes pierced through their feet. So we know that some Jewish people who were killed for being criminals did receive a proper burial, and we also have a thing called the digest, or the digesta, as it's called in Latin. In one of the Roman laws says that you can give a criminal a proper burial if it has been requested and approved by a Roman higher up.
Mhm.
That you can have it buried, given a proper burial, that they weren't all just thrown into a. So we do have a sort of historical precedent of certain people given the right to be given a proper burial, and it aligns with the custom of Jewish law that they would have had to do this. You got to
I
remember that
think
this is a.
Sorry, I was gonna say,
I
I
said,
think that these are good reasons to maybe think that, hey, it's possible, but I think that you could also find plenty of examples of the Romans not respecting local customs. And like I just think I mean I'm willing to say it, it's possible that the Romans would have given over the body and for a proper Jewish burial. I mean, I don't see any reason to say one way or the other, really. Um, I would mostly question why we don't have any Roman sources for the resurrection, because um, there is a case of, I believe that this was in Gaul, which is modern day France, when it was a Roman controlled area where there was a religious prophet that got on the wrong side of the Romans, and the Romans commanded him to die. It was not a crucifixion in this case, but he was sentenced to be eaten by lions. And the Romans actually wrote about this. This is from a Roman account that the lions refused to eat this man, and they described it as a miracle. And these lions were starving, and they refused to eat him. So they wrote about it, like the Romans themselves. So it's always been a little bit strange to me that we don't have any Roman sources for any of these events, maybe until the 90s AD with Josephus.
and you also do have Tacitus, I believe, but
But that's
yeah,
not
it
an
is.
account of the resurrection. That's just an account that there were some people named Christians in Rome during the reign of Nero with the Great Fire. Like, I'm not saying that there were no Christians that believe these things. I just think it's weird that we don't have any Roman writings about specifically the resurrection.
Well, you got to remember, in terms of like that sort of thing, you got to remember that like a lot of the early manuscripts and writings from those times, like the ones that we do have now, it's extremely lucky that we do have them, because there's like the whole fires of Rome, that like Rome like was burnt to the ground almost. There was also the burning of Alexandria, that sort of thing. There's lots of examples of. Oh, and there's also the destruction of Second Temple of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem was sieged, obviously there was lots of chaos and fires and all that sort of stuff, and a lot of things were burnt or hauled away and taken. All sorts of stuff was happening. A lot of because it's such a tumultuous time, especially after Rome started to burn. Um, you're going to have a lot of manuscripts, like especially a lot of early books of the Bible, like the earliest fragment, for example, of the Bible that we have is a fragment of a script called P52, and it's like in tatters, like it's just a fragment of a script. Um, and a lot of people, and it's dated back to the year, I think it was 125. That's generally the more likely. There's a bit of obviously like some degree of error, but a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, that's pretty far after Jesus died." But you got to remember, there's almost certainly books earlier than this being written. It's just that a lot of what was written was lost to fires, and we still do have a lot when it comes to the Gospels. We have a lot because they copied stuff like crazy. They were like writing heaps and heaps and heaps of stuff.
Mhm.
But uh, yeah, it was when you have like all these disastrous events happening, you're bound to lose a lot of sources. So for all I know, there could have been a Roman source that talks about, oh, I was ordered to set these guards at this time, and they abandoned their post. They reported seeing a bright light, blah blah blah, that sort of thing. Um, it is possible that that source could have existed and been written, but it doesn't seem surprising to me that we would also lose that as well.
I mean, yeah, okay. I can't really argue with the idea that there was a source, but maybe it was lost. I mean, whatever, for whatever reason, we don't have a Roman source for the resurrection. So I wanted to address something that I'm seeing in the comments where people are saying that all I'm doing is an argument from incredulity. Um, and I was gonna ask you if you think that that's all I'm coming back at you with is just my own incredulity.
That might be a bit of a harsh way to put it, but I guess from my perspective, you're sort of saying um, the evidence that can be put forward, you're sort of unsure as to its validity or weight. I don't know if I'd call that incredulity so much as asking questions, I guess.
I think
Um,
sorry, go on.
oh yeah, I was just gonna say um, I don't think you're making the argument that we can know that you're not saying like we know the resurrection is false because we don't know what happened. Like that's not what the argument you're making. You're just,
Yeah.
from my perspective, sort of asking questions.
I would say
Uh,
that more so where I'm coming from is looking at other historical examples where I think that we have comparable amounts of evidence as we do for the resurrection, and saying, if I was to accept this level of evidence, if I was to take that level of evidence and accept that the resurrection really happened based off of it, then I would also have to be a Mormon and a Catholic, and I'd have to be a part of several cults. Maybe I'd have to be Taoist and believe that there were immortal sages that were resurrecting people. And like, there's just too many claims of supernatural things happening in history that I can't possibly believe all of them. And so, yeah, I
well,
just
I,
don't see this particular evidence for the resurrection as rising above all those other supernatural claims in history.
well, I guess one thing we could talk about that those other claims don't have would be the prophecies that were saying that this was going to happen ahead of time. I mean, I think you mentioned that one maybe did something about Lady Fatima, but
Yeah.
in
There's
terms of
other
the,
examples of prophecy that I can give in history too, fulfilled prophecy.
I mean, I'd have to look at those other examples too, I suppose.
So,
Um,
like, with
but
the Tang Dynasty in China, that was prophesied that there was a prophecy for somebody with the surname Li was going to start the new dynasty. That's how the Tang Dynasty was started. There are several fulfilled predictions of or fulfilled prophecy of the Oracle of Delphi. The Lady of Fatima example is another one where there were like three small shepherd boys that were saying that Mary will appear on this day and time. And then that's when all these people witness this supernatural occurrences going on. So again, just I wouldn't believe the Oracle of Delphi. I wouldn't believe the Chinese prophecies or these Portuguese shepherd prophecies. So yeah, I just don't see there being any any privileged reasons why the historical evidence for the resurrection rises above these other historical claims of supernatural things.
well, I guess I would argue that in terms of like what the Bible prophesies about Jesus being at least crucified, right? That is like, so there's a thing in the book of Psalms. I think it's Psalm 22. Let me just find that real quick. Yeah, Psalm 22. Here we go.
I would
So
also question, you can still read that, but I'm just saying with, like, the Old Testament prophecies, I would also question why the majority of Jews did not agree that Jesus had fulfilled these prophecies.
well, that gets into a lot of theological stuff because the books of the Old Testament themselves predict that a lot of Jews are not going to believe this. Like that's what one of the predictions in the book that it says you that they'll harden their hearts towards him. That we accounted him cursed, and there's like it goes into a lot of
Mm.
and this is where we get into like deep theology stuff. But uh, basically I would think that in terms of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you don't tend to have like these like for like 700 years prior or something like prophecies that seem to like lead up that sort of all culminate in this figure. Like like for example, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in Psalm 22 it talks about uh you know I'm like poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint, my heart melts like wax, my mouth is like dried up like a potsherd, and it goes into like this whole description of all the bad stuff that's happening to this person. It even talks about my hands and feet are pierced. They cast lots for my garments, you know, which they would have done, like as he would have had his clothes, and the Romans would have wanted them, and things like that. Um, and if you look at all the little details that psalm has, you know, with the hands and feet being pierced, bones being out of joint, being dehydrated, being poured out like water, which is like when Jesus was stabbed, the blood and the water came out of him. All those details you don't actually like. Those details can only really match a crucifixion because there was no killing method which that was known at the time that would have involve your hands and feet being pierced and also your bones being out of joint and like all this different stuff.
So,
Um,
I'm curious with this example because, I'm not a biblical expert on verses or whatever, but I would be curious, do you know what the Jewish explanation for what this verse is saying is? Do you know what their main understanding of it is saying?
I think there's multiple interpretations, but the one I'm familiar with is just that it's just poetry. Like it is in the book of Psalms. Um, and like the Psalms are still considered scripture, right? But that it is basically just King David being melodramatic or something. Which I guess, I mean,
I'd like
but
to
like
highlight this comment as well because maybe I'm not aware of this person is saying that hands and feet pierced is not how crucifixion was done. We also have exact Roman sources for this. So I'm not familiar with the Roman sources of like what their exact method of crucifixion was. Are you familiar what this person is talking about?
no, I'm not familiar because from like I even mentioned like for example we know we have archaeological evidence of unless he's trying to say that the hands themselves weren't pierced, but like the wrists.
Hmm.
Back then, the word for hand would cover from here to like here-ish. So like if you were pierced here, you would be pierced in the hand. That's how they would delineate that. So they would include parts of the wrist as like the hands, and that's what he's talking about. I don't know what he's talking about because we have archaeological evidence of like feet with like nails through them and things like that. We know that this is one of the reasons they did this. One of the things they did, they even they would pierce you in just like the specific way in the wrist so that your hand would sort of seize up, like the muscle, like it was very precise, like where they would nail you, so that the hand would seize up and it almost be like you were being electrocuted. So have you ever had like those muscle things where you put them on and then you press play and it sort of makes your muscles go,
Mhm,
sort of thing?
mhm.
Yeah, yeah. It would have been like that, but like with a nail in there, and
Okay.
they've refined it over time to be able to cause as much pain as possible. I mean, I think it's possible that maybe they tied people up in the earlier times, but by the time Jesus was around, they were definitely using nails like they were nailing people, um, hands and feet to the cross. I'm not sure. Maybe that
So
person
the
who
main line that's okay because I don't know the exact details of how the Romans crucified people either, so, but I was gonna say, um, so the Jewish mainline interpretation for this passage in Psalms is just that it's not referring to a crucifixion and that it's just some sort of poetic language or something. That's their understanding of it, you'd say?
Yeah, they wouldn't look too much into it because they're just saying, "Oh, David's he's going through a lot of pain and he's expressing that in a very, metaphorical language." Because we know that at the time that it was written, King David wasn't literally like this poem isn't talking about somebody who's actually being put to death. King David's like upset. He feels like his enemies are surrounding him, and basically this would have certainly been how it was, like it's not clear that it is talking about like a literal crucifixion until you sort of say, hang on, like it ticks off all the details. Does that make sense? So like if I was to like even like the casting lots for my clothes, my hands and feet are pierced, my bones are all on display. Um, that is a reference to when they would scourge you, and which is where they would whip you with like bone fragments on the end of the whip. They would actually take chunks of flesh off your body. That's how bad it would be, and like you would even have like people's rib cages being visible while they were still alive. Um, so that's very possible that that did happen to Christ. That you could actually like see his like ribs or like his actual
So
bare bones.
the argument now is basically that these verses in the Old Testament provide some sort of prophecy that there would be a crucifixion of the Messiah at some point. Is that the argument? Because again, I pointed to other historical examples of fulfilled prophecy. So I'm just not sure that I would necessarily find these to be um, unique or compelling in that sense. I suppose. Like I just don't see what raises the historical evidence of the resurrection above any other supernatural claim.
Well, you got to instead of sort of looking at the evidence sort of in isolation, you've got to sort
Mhm.
of take each piece of evidence and sort of put it together because yeah, you do have examples of some supernatural events being foretold and then it at least appear. I'm not familiar with these other events that you're mentioning. I have heard of the Fatima one and I think the other one in Portugal, but there there are with all these other examples, they do have evidence for them, but they have less evidence, less of the same kind of evidence, and they also do have other explanations that can account for that evidence, which we tend not to have when it comes to the resurrection. So if I was to line up all the evidence in the sort of like for and then against, right? You have the like not just the one set, like not just the one book and the one prophecy, but like lots and lots and lots of prophecies about the Messiah and that he will be despised, he will be cursed, he will consider him a curse, that he will be killed for, he will be pierced for our transgressions. It does keep like saying this, like by not just like one prophet or like one book of the Bible, but multiple prophets in multiple places in their books. And you have like a whole religious tradition that just sort of carries that and then culminates in this one person. That's just like even one piece of evidence. Then you have the eyewitness accounts of like all the people that say that they saw the risen Jesus. That's
But
another
there
thing.
aren't those. What
Well,
eyewitness
yeah.
account?
Well, I would still say that the apostles' sources are eyewitness accounts. Like you need to account sort of for the creation of those gospel writings.
But
If
okay,
they were not
so my understanding from the biblical scholars, right, is that the gospel writings are written by people, authors that were very familiar with Greek literature traditions, very highly educated. Like, in order to write the kind of prose that these gospel accounts were, you had to be highly educated in a formal Greek educational curriculum. So I don't see how any of the 12 apostles would match that unless you're saying that they linked up with highly educated individuals that then could write their stories down for them.
well, yeah, we actually do have evidence of that because Paul the apostle himself, we know would have been a very highly educated person himself in Greek as well,
Well,
because he
Paul's
was
not one of the eyewitnesses though. I mean, Paul did not
well,
himself
te-
witness the resurrection.
technically he would have because he saw like he saw the risen Christ, like he
But
saw
that was
it
after
was a
the
different
resurrection. That was at a
right,
later
right, right.
time period.
but what I'm trying to say is that Paul was alive at the same time as the other apostles, like they knew each other. They were buddies, right?
Uh-huh.
What could have happened is that at least Luke, I'm pretty sure Luke would have been literate because he was going around writing his own thing, and he traveled with Paul as well. But at the very minimum, Paul would have been literate enough to have written in the Greek, and the apostles could have dictated what they had written to Paul, what they had been saying through oral tradition to Paul, who could have then written it out. Because we know that Paul wrote a lot of letters. We know he was extraordinarily literate. We know that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, a
I'm
Pharisee
not
of Pharisees.
disagreeing about the authorship of Paul's writings. I'm not disagreeing with
Mhm.
Paul. I was just talking about the 12 like that were supposedly eyewitnesses for the actual resurrection event.
Yeah, but you were saying that unless they like found somebody who was educated in the Greek that dictated
Yeah.
this for them, which I'm saying that would have been Paul or
Oh,
somebody.
okay. So
Yeah,
you're saying like Paul would have written the gospel of like Mark or
well, it's possible. Like, I'm not saying it had to be in Paul, but like Paul's a candidate for who it could have been.
okay.
Definitely for Luke. Like, if the author of Luke, if Luke himself, Luke the apostle, was not literate, then he definitely would have gone to Paul to have it written for him, because Luke and Paul were like they were like this. They were buddies. They like Luke traveled with Paul throughout the book of Acts, for example, and we think Luke wrote the book of Acts as well. Um, but in terms of the other gospels, it's entirely possible that they had this tradition, perhaps even in Aramaic or in Hebrew, and then they dictated it to somebody who spoke Greek, because and there is some evidence for that, because um, in a lot of these gospels it'll say, and then Jesus said this, which means this in Greek, or in Hebrew it means this or something. And so, like, I'm trying to think, like Rabbi, for example. They would say, "Hey, Rabbi," and then the author would say, not literally parentheses, but let's say, by the way, Rabbi means teacher in Hebrew. Um, and so that was obviously written for a Greek audience, written by a Greek person, or maybe not a Greek person, but somebody who knew Greek. There is evidence that it could have just been that they had somebody who knew Greek better dictate it to them. But there's also an additional. I wouldn't necessarily have to invoke this, but there's also the possibility that in terms of another miracle that could have happened in Christianity, there's something called the Pentecost, which is the where the apostles get the Holy Spirit gives them what's called the gift of tongues, and I think some people have said that that means that they were able to speak any language that they wanted to, basically, and that was like one of the miracles that happened in the early church that allowed it to spread, that they could have talked to anybody in any language, and that could have possibly meant they could have written it as well. Now again, that depends on what you interpret the gift of tongues to mean. There's disagreement of that in the church today. Like, some people think the gift of tongues just means going so you see like the
Yeah,
charismatics where
I've
they do
seen
the,
some of that.
yeah, so it could either be that, or it's like they start speaking like Arabic and like Greek and Chinese
So
or something.
I can definitely grant you that it's physically possible that the apostles could have linked up with somebody that was literate Greek that could write these things down. I mean, that's a possibility. I don't know about the whole speaking in tongues in another language thing. That would just be another supernatural claim on top of the resurrection, which I would need some sort of, independent verification that such a thing like that would be possible. But in terms of specifically Paul writing Luke's gospel for him, I don't know if the chronology lines up with that, because I think Luke's gospel is, at least in the consensus of biblical scholars now, I believe it's one of the later um, written gospels between like 80 AD and like 90, 95, 100, somewhere around, so like the late
Mhm.
portion of the century. And I believe that Paul was supposed to have already been dead by that time. So I just don't think that the at least the consensus chronology among the historians and academics, I don't think lines up that Paul could have been the writer of this. Now, it would line up maybe for the Gospel of Mark or like the early Gospel like that. I think sure. There's no way I can like disprove that as being a possibility, but I do think that it doesn't necessarily help make compelling evidence that these are eyewitness accounts. Like I can grant that there's a possibility that maybe they're eyewitness accounts, but I just don't think that that is established in a compelling way.
Well, I suppose that I think that I guess to sort of defer to the scholarship, I suppose like because in terms of the possibility of it being sort of dictated by somebody who knew the Greek better, um, I don't know, like, if, like, the specifics of, like, if Paul specifically dictated to Luke or if Luke just didn't need that and he knew how to write on his own. But, I would say that the likelihood of them being able to come into contact with somebody who was this literate and be able to dictate these things directly from the apostles to just getting it on paper is, like, pretty damn likely, such that, like, in terms of the source I have here, tends to suggest, like, the source that I have here is basically saying that they are essentially eyewitness accounts, even if there's a lot of debate around the partiality, or as you said, that there could have been exaggeration. There's obviously a lot of debate about that. But a lot of
But
people
it's
are saying,
what,
like,
like
yeah, these are.
in the consensus, it's somewhere between 35 and 40 years, right? Between the death of Christ and the first gospel. Like you have Paul's writings that were earlier than the gospel writings, but I think it's between 35 and 40 years, right? So I suppose, like I said, I'm willing to grant that it's possible that these could be like the dictated writings of the actual eyewitnesses, but I don't see how there is a compelling reason to think that is the case, more than a possibility.
Well, I mean, I suppose. Well, I mean, again, I'm just sort of going on what the I'm going on what the scholars themselves saying that like this is like in some way or another eyewitness. Now, then when they're saying the eyewitness, they're not necessarily saying that everything that's in the gospels is was eyewitness, but like at least parts of it. Like in the same way that I'm pretty sure I don't want to say Homer, a Greek historian like that. I can't remember if it was Homer or somebody other guy, but he was a eyewitness to like a lot of certain wars and battles, and he would write about certain such supernatural things, and we'd still say, yeah, he was an eyewitness, even
Mhm.
if like we wouldn't look at the supernatural stuff he said and say, oh,
Yeah.
that happened, sort of thing. So the eyewitness, the validity of these accounts as being eyewitness and like being primary sources isn't really disputed. It's just a question of like how much of it can we trust? And if there was been later edits and adaptations and
I
things like that.
don't know if I could agree. I would at least need to see more to agree that it's not being disputed that these are eyewitness accounts, because to my understanding that is very much in dispute whether or not these are eyewitness accounts. So I wouldn't go so far to agree with that claim. But yeah, I'm just not sure if, you know, so far what I've heard for what is the evidence that is compelling or sufficient to accept that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened, it still is not rising above the level of evidence that we have for other supernatural claims throughout history or even contemporary times. Um, yeah, that's the point that I'm still at.
Well, I guess with those other accounts, in my view, the evidence they have in favor for might even be high, but they also have like certain evidence against them, right? And you sort of got to weigh up. So like, my way of looking at it was that you'd have to set up multiple competing theories and which theory is the most likely. And in a lot of those other cases, you're going to find physical explanations, like you gave the example of the Haitian witch doctor who had the
Mhm,
roots and the herbs and things like that. So in terms of the likelihood of a naturalistic account being able to account for all the possibilities,
mhm,
seems to like there's usually a theory where it'll make sense of some of the data, but not all of it. So let me provide an example. Let's say that the Gospels there were fabrications, like the 12 apostles just made up the resurrection thing, but that doesn't deal with the empty tomb. It doesn't deal with the fact that they died for their beliefs, which again doesn't on in a vacuum, dying for your beliefs doesn't mean you weren't lying. But in addition, with the other evidence, it certainly does weigh things in favor of it being the truth, them telling the truth rather than lying. And then there's also the question of if they were intentionally lying, why didn't they just make up something that glorified themselves more? And why didn't they make up something where like they were the ones that came up with these ideas? Like, because lots of people agree that Jesus had wonderful teachings and had good ways of a good way of life. Why didn't they just claim it for themselves? They would get much more glory and influence, and they would be seen as more authoritative. They would have had more authority and that sort of thing. And so then you look at the evidence of like, okay, maybe they thought they saw a resurrection, but it was just a series of mass hallucinations and false memories, which is possible. And the source that I have that I'm relying on does talk about the possibility of that and the science that goes into that. But the reason why that doesn't sort of deal with all the evidence is because you don't get an empty tomb out of hallucination. You also don't get what was the other thing? So like that would for their beliefs, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to account for that being able to be spread, because you got to remember the claims that these people are making. A lot of the times, the person that they're talking about is somebody that they could have verified with like other people other than them knew them in the community, right? Like Jesus went around preaching and probably talked to like a lot of people, right? A lot of people would have remembered Jesus Christ. There would have been witnesses to the miracles he performed. Now, again, whether or not they were real miracles or not, maybe he pulled some sort of a trick or something, but still, you're going to have people that, like, when these apostles, because these apostles aren't just claiming he just rose from the dead. It's not just, oh, this guy rose from the dead. He also happens to be the same guy that's doing all these miracles, and he did it to this person, and they named the names. They would have been able to go and talk to the guy and be like, hey, did he really heal your leg? And he'd be like, yeah. Or did he really fix you from being blind? And we've been like, yeah, he did. And sure, we can explain that in terms of maybe, I don't know, what's the word? Placebo effects of some kind, or we can't have those explanations, but each and every single one of those theories only explains portions of the evidence, never can take account of the whole thing. And so when you look at each of the pieces of the evidence for the whole thing, it all sort of points to the resurrection being far more likely than any naturalistic explanation.
Okay, so I'd like to deal with that argument that it's more likely than the alternatives, right? So first of all, I don't think that we have, or we talked about the empty tomb, but I don't think that we established that the empty tomb was something that needs to be accounted for because, again, I mean, I didn't see any sources that were irrefutable that there was an empty tomb. So I don't necessarily see that as being something that needs to be accounted for because I don't see what the evidence is that there truly was an empty tomb. But in terms of because I haven't made this statement that I think that the apostles were lying. I was likening them to other cults in history or cult members that we're familiar with that are very much willing to die for their beliefs. Um, like the Taiping Rebellion is a great example. It is the bloodiest civil war in all of human history. There were millions upon millions of people that were willing to die for this cult where I don't know if you're familiar with the Taiping Rebellion, but it was
No.
a Chinese cult leader that was preaching that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. So
Oh,
it's
I
kind
think
of
I
an
have heard of
offshoot of
that.
Christianity. But yeah, millions upon millions of people were willing to fight and die for this cause. It was the bloodiest civil war of all time. And
Yeah,
so
I think
I
I have
don't
heard
see
of that.
any, I don't, you know, I think that people believe things that are not true all the time. Like, I think that this is the norm in human history that people have beliefs that they're willing to die for that are not true. So I don't see any difficulty in explaining what historically occurred with Jesus and his followers as having these members. Whether or not they truly saw anything, I don't know. But I do think that it's evident that they believed what they were preaching. I don't know exactly what they were preaching since the oral traditions, we don't know what they were in the earliest days of Christianity. We only have Paul's writings and then the Gospels. But again, I don't see any issue with them believing that this was the case and that he rose and resurrected and for their sins, whatever. Like, I don't see why that would not be the more plausible explanation than a supernatural resurrection actually occurring, which to me is one of the least probable explanations because it involves something that we have never witnessed in any kind of scientifically validated way.
So in terms of 'cause there was a couple of things. So first there was the whether or not we established the empty tomb. So I guess I
Yeah.
want to sort of talk about that first. Um, in terms of establishing the empty tomb, you got to remember that there's basically no reason for the apostles to have lied about the empty tomb. So let's say, for example, that Christ was just thrown in an open grave, thrown in some pit, discarded somewhere. The apostles, like nothing, like, and then let's say that in an alternate universe, the apostles just wrote about that's what happened. Like that, yeah, they discarded our master's body and desecrated it. It was an unholy thing that they did to him. Blah blah blah. Again, if this like I know you don't necessarily think it was like a fabrication, but if this was a sort of narrative, they could have used that to sort of heighten the drama, I guess. If but they didn't, right? So
They're also trying to convince other people, like, before there was any written gospels or whatever, they're trying to convince people that this resurrection happened. So if they didn't have a tomb or whatever, like, that'd be one of the very first things that people would ask was, "Well, where's this tomb?" And then, obviously, they would, "Hey, there's an empty tomb that was discovered to be empty." I mean, that would be one of the very first things that any rational person would be asking if they were being told that there was this man that resurrected. They'd say, "Well, I want to see the tomb."
right, but like that sort of requires. So if the apostles are saying that there is a tomb, then that requires of them a like you said, people want to see the tomb, so that requires them to provide the evidence of the tomb and that Joseph of Arimathea actually did pay for that tomb and that it is his, and they'd have to go talk to Joseph of Arimathea. There's like ways to verify and like poke holes in that sort of thing. If they are, if there was no tomb, then that would give them sort of less less so I'm sort of juggling two things in my head because if he was just thrown in an open grave, then there's less for them to explain. Does that make sense? Like there's like they don't have to talk about there being a tomb. That's not like a piece of evidence that sort of that
Yeah,
they can
but
be held to.
you could see that
Um,
that would be less convincing to the people that they're trying to persuade that this happened. Like if they said, "Well, like where's the tomb?" and then they say, "Well, we don't he was just thrown into a pit with a bunch of other bodies, so we can't independently verify that there is no dead body." Like,
well, you could say that you could say like if like this would be assuming you're making this up, which I know is not your position, but the other thing I was going to say is that if we do establish that the apostles believe that they were telling the truth, they couldn't have also been lying about the tomb, because if they were lying about the tomb, then they would know this is a fabrication. This is a thing that they're making up. But if they know that they're telling the truth and they actually believe in this stuff, they wouldn't fabricate the tomb, because then it's like, well, then they know that they're lying. You know what I mean? There's a tension between them actually believing what they are saying versus the actual tomb being empty. And in accordance, not only that, but the Jewish sort of enemies of Christianity at the time, their number one explanation for what all was happening was that they stole the body, not that there was no tomb he was buried in or that he was thrown in an open pit. They don't like they
mhm.
don't talk about that. They don't, from what I've seen anyway. They don't talk or entertain that idea. They just say the body was stolen from the tomb,
I
heavily implying there was a
believe
tomb.
that, and I need to look this up more specifically, but I believe that that's also the explanation in the Quran, I think.
Yeah, in the Quran. Well, no, in the Quran, they believe that Jesus never actually died or was hung on the cross, but they they believe that Judas Iscariot was made to look like Jesus, and they hung
Mm,
him up, and so it wasn't actually Jesus, but it was Judas Iscariot or something along those lines. Like Jesus never
mm.
actually died on the
Okay,
cross, or he was never even crucified.
okay.
Um, uh, which is interesting. But
But yeah,
I
honestly, between the 2, between somebody just stealing the corpse and the corpse being resurrected, I think I know which one I would think is more likely.
Sure, but that's sort of like like the fact that all the Jews were saying that the corpse was stolen. And if you look at the sources where they're saying, yeah, they'd stolen the corpse, it's a sort of a tacit admission that there was a tomb. Because again, at the time, obviously this is a much they have much more access to the evidence and the historical information than we do, and they could talk to Joseph of Arimathea and all that sort of stuff. There doesn't seem to be a question of if there was a tomb for them. which
Mhm.
is that the exclusion of that is very important because it
And
seems to be taken for granted.
which source are you getting this from?
I ca there was a I remember there was a Jewish source writing about, there was the Jewish leaders. I don't have it with me now, but I remember there was a Jewish source of like, uh, a Jewish I don't know if they were I think it was Sanhedrin, where they were basically they're trying to deal with this, they were trying to deal with Christianity, and they were saying, um, all that's happening here is that they just stole the body. That's all that happened here. And, that was the, and what I don't have the source with me, but I do have a source that talks about the source. So that source that I keep referring to. So I wanna sort of link it in the chat. I'll copy and paste the title. It's written by a secular historian. Uh, Sorry, one sec. I just gotta put that in there. And that was in 2015. There you go. I've linked that in the chat there in the comments. That's the source that I'm using. It was written by a fella named Stephen Rogers. And in this source in here, it does talk about this as evidence that let's see. Blah blah blah. I'm trying to look for it, but I know it says in here that that evidence for the open tomb is the fact that the early Jewish sources were saying that the body was stolen.
Okay.
Um,
So
so yeah, if you look at
I'll
that
check
source,
that out and maybe see what these early Jewish sources are because I'm not familiar with them. Um, but yeah, I'm still not sure why I would like I know you're saying that the supernatural explanation has more explanatory power for all of the circumstances of this than any of the naturalistic explanations. But I remain unconvinced about why a non supernatural explanation would not be able to explain all of the facts. Like, I can, for the sake of the discussion moving forward, if you'd like me to grant the empty tomb, I can do so. I'm not sure if like I would necessarily agree that there is an empty tomb, but because I haven't seen these early Jewish sources, I'm okay with granting that for the sake of moving the conversation forward.
mm. And we could sort of just grant that, though it is a contentious issue, like because it is still debated. But this is one of the like I wouldn't say it's like a settled thing in scholarship. From what I've seen, it's somewhat 50-50, or it's swayed throughout time. There was a brief period where a lot of people were saying, yeah, he was just thrown in a ditch, but recently it's become sort of more 50-50. So we can, yeah, we can like if we grant the empty, we could say if the empty tomb is established, then we have a good may or may not have a good evidence for the resurrection kind of thing. And I guess with the empty tomb, I guess this sort of comes down to a very sort of something of a philosophical discussion as what reason do we have to sort of favor naturalistic over explanations over supernatural one, especially because from my perspective,
Mhm.
um, supernatural and natural kind of nominal categories. You know, there's nothing inherently that makes something inherently supernatural versus natural. These are just kind of things we'd like to categorize and call supernatural. To me, these are just two possible, or maybe more than two or more possible events. So it's like on the one hand, you have the resurrection. Sure, it's certainly a bizarre thing, but you know, it's just another thing that I don't view as obviously I view it as different, but I don't view it as categorically different to saying that you know, there was mass hallucinations or that the body was stolen or something like that. I view them as like in the same category. So like I consider them as possibilities, but I don't. It's not like a different necessarily different scales for me.
So I would make the distinction, obviously, between supernatural and natural as um, one of the categories does not violate any known laws of physics or the universe, and then the other one, the miraculous claim, does. So
Well, not necessarily. You don't have to have a view of miracles that necessitates that it violates the laws of the universe. Any more than believing that the fact that we can fly violates the laws of gravity. You know what I mean? Like
I
if you
don't
fly
know
on
what
planes.
you mean. No.
Well, what I'm saying is that these miracles could be operating by other sort of I guess, universal laws that one might as well call physics. Like, what makes something a law of physics, right? It kind of like when something is declared as a law, it kind of it kind of just depends on a certain sense of regularity that we observe,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
uh like even that, like here's an example, like gravity. Like we call it the law of gravity, but why call it a law of gravity? There's no gravity in space. Like there's like I obviously that doesn't violate the
But
regularity of
there
it.
is gravity in space, so I don't know what that means.
Well, I mean like not not in like the vacuum, like you know what I mean, like the
No, I don't know what you mean. I mean, we observe gravity in space between celestial objects all the time.
well yeah, like yeah the like you have dark matter and like I'm talking about those things where those things aren't present. But I guess that's a
But,
what
like,
I'm
we
trying to
have,
say is
like,
just that
the orbitals of the planets, like, the orbits in our planet of our planets in our solar system, that's gravity in
yeah,
space, so
well, it's not that's not so much gravity in like it doesn't really matter. What I'm trying to sort of get at is that we should be probably looking at gravity more as a this is getting a bit. Uh, I tend to look at gravity as more of a property than so much like a law TM, like it's been written on a legal document. You know what I mean? Like I
well,
see it as more
a
of a
law is
property.
just a description of, like, something that happens every time we look at it in a precise, calculable way.
Yeah,
So, like,
exactly. So like
you could
that's what I
calculate
mean.
what the strength of gravity would be given certain variables. Like, again, I just I don't see if maybe you could provide an example of a supernatural miracle that would not violate the laws of physics, because I don't know how you it, to me it seems like definitionally a supernatural miracle would be a violation of naturalistic laws.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. Like I wouldn't hold to that definition of miracle. So like it depends on what you mean by like laws of physics, right? Because like this is sort of what I'm trying to get at is that like let's take quantum mechanics for example, right? Quantum mechanics seems to be at least in tension with general relativity. They don't sort of line up and agree with one another. So and we've obviously observed general relativity first, so we would say, well, we have the laws of general relativity over here, but then we have quantum mechanics, and it seems to behave in a sort of irregular fashion, which sort of does go against a sort of mechanistic view of the universe. Yet at the same time, we wouldn't say quantum mechanics is supernatural. It's just that it has its own laws that we're still working towards reconciling with other laws of the universe. I don't see any reason why anything miraculous could not also be that. Like, so for example, if God is a conscious entity who has command over like an infinite amount of like energy at his disposal, and he's an immaterial being who can interact with the material plane, assuming that doesn't violate any laws of physics, which I don't see any reason why would violate any laws of physics. Um, I would say that like um, God being immaterial, he would just interact with his infinite energy, like and just like if God sort of resuscitated Christ by using immaterial means to sort of resuscitate him, like start his neurons moving again and things like that, and just us being able to describe it within scientific ways. The line between supernatural and natural kind of becomes arbitrary where you want to define it, because technically you could, like I said, you could define quantum mechanics as supernatural. I wouldn't,
I don't think
but
you
that's
could though. I really don't think that you could define quantum mechanics as supernatural. I mean, there are laws within quantum mechanics. I mean,
yeah, but
that there
like
are
it's
equations that
also
give accurate uh, results.
but it also like is fundamentally probabilistic. Like we can't actually one of the things we do know that's so regular, like one of the laws of quantum mechanics is that we can't seem to predict um, you know, uh where the electron's gonna sort of go
I
and
get
that sort of thing.
there's the measurement problem. I understand that quantum mechanics is probabilistic. I just don't think being probabilistic means that you could categorize that as non-natural or supernatural. I just don't see that argument. And I mean, it's an interesting point to say that God could have used naturalistic mechanisms to revive Jesus from the dead, but to me, I mean, God is still a fundamentally supernatural entity. So even if he used natural means to do something, if he's the one doing it, it still seems like it would be not natural. Like it'd be supernatural. So I don't know. Maybe this is a weird distinction and we're getting bogged down in like weird details here. But again, without, I guess maybe the issue here is that I'm fundamentally unconvinced that there are supernatural things. I don't think that there's been compelling evidence that a supernatural event has ever occurred. Like, I can point to the reliability of methodological naturalism, like within science. Um, I can point to all of the tested, verified predictions that come from naturalistic theories. And it just seems like naturalism is a much more reliable lens of analysis, and that I'm just not convinced that there's been any recorded incidents of supernatural phenomenon, not from the resurrection, or I mean, I've listed numerous other historical examples of supernatural claims that I also don't believe.
Well, the thing is that I don't grant these categories like with the way that I view the world. I don't divide things up into supernatural and natural. I think I don't think they're sort of valid categories, to be perfectly honest. I don't really have these categories where I make those distinctions. And so, like for example, you mentioned that you haven't observed anything that's supernatural, and then we were talking about quantum mechanics. Well, I guess it'd be kind of hard to know what makes quantum mechanics not supernatural, other than like again, I wouldn't say quantum mechanics is supernatural simply because I don't grant that category. I don't even know what the difference would be between natural and supernatural. Other like again, if the definition of if this is the only definition of a supernatural is that it goes against the mechanistic laws of the universe, then quantum mechanics would absolutely like qualify. Otherwise, like you could have like magic, right? Like if I was able to like make fire come out of my hands, but the way that magic work, like magic operates by certain laws, like in Full Metal Alchemist or something, that's still magic. But even if it operates by specific laws, that doesn't make it like like the line between whether that makes it physics or science versus naturalistic. You know what I mean? Like even in
I would just
full,
thoroughly reject the idea that quantum mechanics is in any way non-natural or supernatural. Like in quantum mechanics, quantum systems evolve very deterministically through the Schrodinger equation. Um, Granted, like there's Bourne's rule and everything for when you measure something, and there are probabilistic results of measurement, but the actual time evolution of the wave function is precisely described by Schrodinger's equation. I don't see any supernatural elements of quantum mechanics at all. I mean, and they're describing nature, they're describing natural entities, and they're not invoking any magic or supernatural phenomenon.
well, there's two things about that. Well, one of the like the most popular interpretations of quantum mechanics. Again, we haven't solved quantum mechanics, but one of its most popular interpretations is the Copenhagen.
Yeah.
And unless I'm wrong, the Copenhagen necessitates that it's not just that the results appear random to us, but that they are actually fundamentally random to us. Like it's not just that we could find an
Not
extra
random,
variable
but
that
probabilistic.
well, yeah, like in the Copenhagen, I don't think there's like a distinction there. Like the it actually behaves as essentially pure mathematics until it becomes actualized. Like it can only be described as the sine function, the psi function. Sorry, not sine function. But I still even wouldn't call that supernatural, and I don't think you would either. Like if that's what
No,
um
I wouldn't call that supernatural. No, I wouldn't call
what's
anything in quantum mechanics supernatural.
but that's what I'm sort of trying to get at. What then makes something supernatural? Because it can't just be that something is like probabilistic or that there's tension between because
I provided you my criteria for what would make something supernatural is a violation of the laws of physics. That's my
yeah,
understanding of what supernatural would be.
but but then but like that's the thing is that the quantum mechanics seems to contradict, at least without, like, at this moment, there's a contradiction between quantum mechanics and general relativity. So that means one of the other has to be supernatural, then, by your definition. Again, I don't think that's your view, and I wouldn't hold to that view
No,
either.
because it just depends on like the context, right? It's the fact that general relativity isn't used on quantum scales. Like that would be it's just depending on what scale you look. It's not like we would say that um like the retrograde motion of the planets violates the laws of physics because it violates Newton's laws of gravitation. Like it's not a supernatural entity, it's just described better by general relativity.
Yeah, well,
So
that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. Like, um, if we have sort of Newton's laws and they're being violated, well, then we say, well, then his laws are wrong. We have a different set of laws that better describe the situation. Well, what if I was to describe like laws that would explain things that would certainly could be described as miraculous, but they are laws that make better sense of our observations? Like, does that make sense? Like,
if you
that's
had that, then that would be great. But I don't think that any such mathematical descriptions of supernatural claims exist. Like
well, I kind of do. Like, I would say that a violation of the law of conservation, either of matter of energy or anything like that, would be a like not. I still think that God, not even God himself, could do that. I think that that would be a violation of logic itself, because any violation of the law of conservation would entail a mathematical contradiction. And if you go by the definition of omnipotence, that he can do anything that's logically possible, violating math means violating math is not logically possible. So even miracles would have to follow the law of conservation of matter and energy. And I hold to that. I believe that. And so that's why I don't make this, I would never make this distinction between natural and supernatural, because it would sort of, you know what I mean? Like, I just don't hold to those categories. I just don't see
um
a reason why to hold to those categories, especially if by holding to these categories and we sort of lump things. Because I've never actually met somebody that actually gave me like here's an example. Would you say fairies are supernatural?
yes.
Okay, but if let's say that we lived in a universe where fairies did exist and there's just like little tiny human people with wings that flutter, nothing about that violates the laws of conservation of energy. In fact, you can describe that in purely physical terms, right?
I guess my conception of fairies involves that they do magic. So if we're just talking about fairies that don't do anything supernatural and they're just very small people with wings, then I guess that could be a type of animal that exists in a without violating any laws of physics. Sure, but that's not
Well,
what I would consider to be fairies.
well, let's say that there was a law of physics that let's say fairies could make like lightning come out of their hands. Let's say that there
Uh-huh.
was a law of physics that like that determines the way electrons behave when interacting with conscious entities that are that small, let's say, and so that you could describe every single thing the fairy is doing, um, so that such that they're shooting lightning out of their hands, but you can describe that purely in terms of scientific things. You can have map out all of that out with equations. I see no reason why you couldn't do that, and why you couldn't also just call that naturalistic, other than a sort of intuitive sense of like we sort of vaguely understand that like fairies are supernatural, ghosts are supernatural, God is supernatural,
Okay,
free
so
will may or may not be supernatural. It's
this
sort
is
of like
kind of
a
sounding to me like the idea that any sufficiently advanced technology is going to appear like magic to those that don't understand the principles that it's working on.
pretty
So
much, yeah.
so yeah, you're saying that there's some kind of way that just methodologically we don't know that could explain how the resurrection occurred without it violating any laws of physics, and you're saying that there's could be a potentially naturalistic explanation for the resurrection. Am I understanding that?
Well, potentially naturalistic in the sense that I don't grant the distinction between the supernatural and the natural. That's not like a again, I don't recognize those categories. I would simply like when I just look at something happen, I wouldn't say that's natural, that's supernatural, that can't happen, that sort of thing. I just like things just happen. I don't grant these terms or these categories that I place onto reality. That's something we create as human beings. We create those terms, natural and supernatural, and we're sort of trying to get reality to bend to our understanding of those two categories, but it might not fit evenly. So I think it's better just to do without the categories in general.
All right. Well, even if we get rid of any distinction between supernatural and natural, I still think that based on our lack of empirical verification that resurrection is possible, naturally or supernaturally by any means, that it would still be the less plausible explanation.
Well, I would still say that, like, empirically, we do know it's empirically possible for people to come back from the dead. It's just that usually
After
only like a
three
couple of
days,
after 3 days. Not we don't have that unless, of course, Jesus is an example of that, right? But that's kind of the thing. Like, if we have a principle, let's say that we were studying, like, let's say we're going out there and studying how long is it possible to come back from after you've been dead, right? And we've observed some people have been dead for 10 minutes and come back, an hour that have come back. Um, and then we see, oh, this guy died for 3 days and came back. Now, if we're going to include that evidence as part of our inductive empirical evidence, um, or we'll try to verify whether we're going to include that, we can't presuppose the sort of supernatural idea that that has to be excluded because it's supernatural. It either is a part of our inductive observations or it isn't, right? Um, there's no there's no reason why that wouldn't be able to happen if it's something that we are observing, right?
again, I don't know if I don't think we're observing anything similar to what is proposed to have happened during the resurrection. Even if you claim that there could be a naturalistic explanation, which I don't think has been empirically verified for such a 3-day interval of a resurrection. Like, yeah, you can have people that are legally pronounced dead that can then be resuscitated, but I would not put that even in the same category as with Jesus. And before we move on in the discussion, I do want to say I wanted to keep this under 2 hours, and so we are starting to approach that. And I just wanted to highlight one comment. Thanks, Yahoo, again for pointing out that I'm only a few subs away from hitting 1,000. So it would be super awesome to hit 1,000 subs sometime soon. For anyone that's not listening, or that anyone that is listening that is not subscribed, please reconsider your position. It would mean a lot to me. So thank you very much for everyone that is subscribed. I appreciate each and every one of y'all. So sorry to do a little plug there, Aiden. But
That's okay.
yeah, if we could, I guess I'd be interested in maybe if we could reflect on everything that we've talked about up to this point and kind of we could talk about where we've come to in this discussion because
Mm.
I'm a little bit confused now with the last few lines of argumentation that we've gone through about supernatural and non-supernatural and describing the resurrection because it seems to me like maybe what you've been saying is a little bit unorthodox within the Christianity because it sounds like most Christians acknowledge that the resurrection would have to be a supernatural miracle. So this is the first time that I've encountered anyone trying to describe any kind of naturalistic way that this could be possible.
Well, again, like, what I'm describing wouldn't be naturalistic or non-naturalistic. Again, I just want to clarify that. Like, I don't grant the categories. So, like, those other Christians would categorize. Like, I suppose I could, if I was to describe if I had to establish those categories of what I think they mean, I would say supernatural would be anything that violates the laws of conservation of matter and energy. And if that's the definition we're going with, then I definitely don't believe in the supernatural, not even with God. I would describe him purely in naturalistic terms. But usually there's there's usually more something more attached to the idea of naturalism. Usually it's sort of doesn't have to, but it usually is attached to physicalism. And I wouldn't call myself a physicalist, just to sort of clarify my position on that.
Okay. Um this would be getting way off topic, but I could point you towards some examples within quantum mechanics that maybe would appear to violate the conservation of energy, just granted on a very small time scale. So there
Yeah.
is an uncertainty relationship between delta E and delta T, so energy and time. So there are certain um, decay processes in like quantum field theory where an electron will decay into like a W boson that has more energy than the electron had. But then that
Mm.
W boson will then quickly decay into other products where the conservation of energy is conserved. But just that intermediate step would appear to be violated. So there are certain examples that you could lay down, but again, none of those are considered to be supernatural. Um, so yeah, I don't want to get sidetracked on conservation of energy, but there is a lot of really interesting um, aspects to that. I'm just trying to figure out where we've gotten with our discussion of the resurrection. Um, do you still hold that these historical like accounts that we've gone through tonight, do you hold that those should be sufficient or compelling evidence for anyone to believe in the resurrection, or like are you okay with saying something like, you know, I it takes kind of a leap of faith to believe in the resurrection, and it's not just purely based on the the historical evidence.
Well, I would say that I sort of mentioned at the beginning that this conversation is going to sort of come down to how you view again the resurrection in terms of it being like I mentioned supernatural and natural, right? If you are a physicalist, right, then
Hmm.
obviously you can look at the evidence for the resurrection and say, no, this doesn't cut the mustard. And that would be fair enough from their perspective. And then you'd say somebody who's not a physicalist, like a metaphysical dualist like myself, who would look at that and say, okay, well, that does look like that seemed to have happened. Excuse me. And I wouldn't say believing in the resurrection itself is faith based rather than evidence based. It's more those prior positions of like physicalism versus dualism. They are also influenced by evidence, but a step back even from that is going to like those kind of metaphysical frameworks are going to rest upon axioms, and then those axioms for either side are going to require faith. So I suppose you have to have faith either way. It's not a case of one is having faith and the other's having evidence per se. It's just that we're both going to have to sort of reflect upon our axiomatic positions, and they're going to come down to a sort of faith claim in either case. Um, but from those axiomatic positions, the evidence will take you in one way or the other, if that makes sense.
So like for me in that I don't just like presuppose God or, you know, supernatural miracles or whatever. Like I don't have that pre-existing faith. For me to just be purely looking at what the historical evidence is for the resurrection, do you think that just that historical evidence that we've gone through tonight should be sufficient to convince me that the resurrection happened, or does it take like other kinds of evidence to kind of make that a compelling case?
I suppose it would take another kind of discussion that the resurrection doesn't solve whether or not the supernatural exists. I wouldn't say. It sort of takes another discussion which we've briefly gone into tonight as to how we categorize the supernatural. Do we even need to recognize those categories and like our fundamental beliefs in metaphysics, basically? Which obviously the resurrection and like the historical evidence isn't going to tell you. Like the resurrection of Jesus Christ isn't going to tell you whether everything's physical or not, right? It's not going to tell you whether there's like something physical and immaterial. It's not going to tell you if panpsychism is true, right? And that's obviously like if you're a panpsychist, obviously the
Wait,
resurrection of
wait,
Jesus Christ is
let's
going
not get let's not get into panpsychism real quick. But
to.
I'm just this is a very interesting response to me because um, you're saying that one could, based on the historical evidence alone, you're saying that one could accept that it's compelling evidence that the resurrection happened, but claim that it was naturalistic. Am I understanding that?
um, once again, it would depend on how you're defining naturalistic. I do believe the resurrection of Jesus Christ followed the laws of I don't think the law of conservation of matter and energy was violated in order to make it happen. So from that definition, yes, I would say it's naturalistic. Um, but I do believe that maybe something, that like something immaterial was involved. I don't believe immaterial things violate the laws of conservation of matter and energy. That's like the one limitation I would at least put on them. And so if I was a physicalist, I would say this evidence is not enough to get me to change my physicalism, which leads me to rejecting the resurrection. But if you are a metaphysical dualist or something similar, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the historical evidence alone should be enough to convince you. Yes.
And those other examples that we talked about tonight, because I mean, I would consider myself a physicalist, so maybe that's why I'm having difficulty with um, thinking that the historical evidence alone creates a compelling case that the resurrection really happened. But with those other examples, like the signed legal affidavit, eyewitness testimony in Mormonism, or like those various appearances, the group appearances of the Virgin Mary to Catholics all around the world. We didn't even talk about this one, but there are the Nero resurrection events. So lots of claims that Emperor Nero was resurrected, and various like claims of a resurrected Nero would be leading an army or something, and that army would be slaughtered by the Romans, so that those people died in their belief that they were truly fighting with the resurrected Nero. That was very common. That happened like 3 times in history. So I'm just like, if I was willing to accept that the resurrection happened based just on the historical evidence for it, would I also then be accepting the historical evidence for Mormonism and these Virgin Mary appearances and Nero and the various Taoist immortals? Like there are so many claims within history that are supernatural in nature. If I was to accept the resurrection based on the historical evidence, I don't know why I would not accept any of these others.
Well, a lot of these other ones have a lot more like it really comes down to a case by case basis where you have to examine the moving parts. And So, for example, with the Mormonism accounts with Joseph Smith, um, sorry, one sec, it's all good. Um, Sorry, my mom just walked in here. Get out of my room, mom. Nah. Uh, but with the accounts with Joseph Smith, there's you've got the so according to Joseph Smith, the gospels that he had, which are talk about the Jews coming to the Americas, um, that is a that not only was that written on golden tablets, but we would also expect to see evidence of Jewish civilization in America, and archaeological evidence for that. We don't have that.
Well, okay, but when I pointed that out with the Romans, that we would expect there to be Roman accounts if there was a resurrection event in Jerusalem, and you said, well, maybe that existed at one point but was lost. So, I
Well,
mean,
with the Roman accounts, we're talking about pieces of like parchment and like papyrus that could have easily been burnt in the fires of Rome or the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. Whereas with the archaeological evidence you'd expect to see for Joseph Smith, like we're talking entire civilizations, like you would expect to see remnants of ruins. No fire could ever remove this. A fire of Rome could absolutely burn all the parchment um, in that case, but you wouldn't expect like you'd expect like to see evidence of some sort of destructive event that wiped away the evidence for
okay,
the
so
civilization in the
it's
Americas.
okay to reject eyewitness testimony of, you know, I would describe it as supernatural occurrences. I don't know what you describe it, but there are eyewitness signed affidavits for some of the claims in Mormonism. So you're saying that there are reasons to reject certain eyewitness testimony based on like other non-existent archaeological like basically contradictions in archaeology with the claims. So what
Well,
about like
it
the
comes down
Virgin Mary?
to well, just to address the archaeological
Okay.
evidence thing, it kind of just comes down to what you'd expect to see. When it comes to the Roman writings of the resurrection, um, you'd expect to see maybe a Roman soldier writing a report that Jesus' body's gone missing. You wouldn't even necessarily expect it to say, oh, he's resurrected or oh, somebody stole the body. You would just expect him to say, oh, well, there's a missing body. And the Roman guards or Jewish guards or whatever, they were punished or something. I don't know. Um,
But I mean, it describes to be fair, it does describe like lots of saints being resurrected at the same time as well, right?
yeah, I think so, but it's kind of hard to know. Um,
I mean,
again, that they wouldn't.
event like that would definitely be written like somebody would have been writing if there were if there were like multiple bodies being raised from the dead in Jerusalem and walking on the streets and everything. I think that'd be an event that we should reasonably expect there to have been writings about.
But you got to remember that that happened exclusively in Jerusalem. Like that's where it said, like, because that's where the prophets would have died. The dead in Jerusalem would
Yeah.
have risen,
But
and that's where the destruction of the temple happened.
there were lots and lots of literate people in Jerusalem that I would think rationally would have written that down if it had occurred.
I think that's well, you got to remember that like very few of those survived Jerusalem. You know what I mean? Like we do have Josephus, and I'm not sure what his views on the resurrection are.
Well,
Um,
he was Jewish, not Christian, so I would hazard a guess.
well, in Judaism, there still is a resurrection of the dead. It's just that there's different views within Judaism as how that's supposed to pass out. Like the Pharisees did
Yeah,
believe in a kind of resurrection. The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection at all. I don't know what he would have been. There was another group, the Essenes. No, not the Essenes. Could have been the Essenes as well. Anyway, you've got like a bunch of different views on the resurrection,
yeah.
and yeah, like again, knowing that the temple at Jerusalem and just Jerusalem in general was sieged, millions upon millions of people died. Like I think it might have been more than the Holocaust. I can't remember how many. Let me just Google that real quick. Um,
I mean, my point is that we just have other Roman writings for somewhat analogous events, like the one I described in Gaul, where they sentenced that guy to be killed and the lions refused to eat him. And we do have the accounts of the Romans describing that. So it's just weird to me that there are no other non New Testament accounts of this until Josephus, basically. And again, the way Josephus words it is that he's just describing that that's the claim. He's not saying that Jesus resurrected. He just said that, it was claimed that he resurrected after 3 days. So again, I'm just not sure why I would privilege the historical evidence of the resurrection above any other historical claims of supernatural phenomena.
yeah, I guess I would. Yeah, it's going to come down to a case by case basis. So like in the case of you know, I would have to examine each one and weigh up the evidence. Like I can't sort of categorically say that this is the method. Like you're gonna have to sort of look at weighing up weighing it up on both sides. And if the physical explanation or the what could be described as the naturalistic explanation um stacks up as high being more likely than the um but if I take a look at these other examples um and it seems like they actually happened, then yeah, I would believe in them. Um,
Even if
uh,
they're like, because in my opinion, if you were to do that, eventually you would be having to believe in contradictory things. Like you couldn't both be a Catholic and a Mormon and a Haitian voodoo believer and like believing in the immortal sages in Taoism. Like to me, eventually, if you were to accept the bar of the resurrection evidence as being sufficient, then eventually you would be believing in things that are contradictory from different practices based on the historical texts.
So for me, the bar that has been set by the resurrection, right, is like up to upwards of like 700 years of prophecy prior to. And then you also have confirmation of the historical figure that was supposed to have actually, died and resurrected. Confirmation of their death by the means that was claimed, so death by crucifixion. Evidence of the tomb. Again, that one's a bit more contentious, but there is solid evidence for the tomb.
Well,
That
even
tomb
the
then being
prophecy
empty.
is contentious. A lot of these premises are contentious.
Well, all of them are going to be, but like in terms of
Yeah.
like that's going to be the case for everything, right? Like it's like when I say that the tomb is a bit more contentious, that one's a bit more of a 50-50 in terms of the scholarship, though I would argue that the odds of there being an empty tomb, as well as just the tomb in general, is more likely than not. Um, and so, like when you add all those things up, as well as the eyewitnesses, the fact that they were willing to die for their beliefs, and the fact that they were also not seeking glory for themselves, right? That's the thing, is that a lot of these prophecies, they glorify, like, Jesus is prophesying like that he's going to die, right? Like that's usually, in a lot of these prophecies, like in the what's the other one where the guy with Jesus' brother in China? What was that one again? The
Oh, that was during the Taiping Rebellion.
Taiping Rebellion. Yeah, so he's like, yeah, I'm prophesied that I should become emperor. It's like, like it's like that's a bit convenient. It's like, oh yeah, I have a prophecy that I will get all the money and all the bitches, and like
Hey, well,
it's like,
Jesus was saying that he was the Son of God. He was the King of the Jews. I mean, that's pretty up there. But I understand what you mean. But I would just say that his followers seem to genuinely believe that he was the Messiah. So I
mm.
don't see that as being that strange that they were not then claiming that they were the ones doing all these miracles. Like, I don't know. I don't think maybe this is our fundamental disagreement here, but I don't think that there's any difficulty in explaining the historical evidence from a a point of view where there was no actual resurrection. It seems to me that you could have the whole history of early Christianity and its development all in a scenario where the resurrection didn't actually happen. And I don't see any difficulties in explaining the facts of history through that lens.
Well, okay, so I guess to provide sort of a comprehensive, I guess, a narrative, if you will. I don't like the term narrative, but like if you were to provide a narrative, from a naturalistic perspective of like what really happened, what really went down, how would you connect all the dots? You know how they have those like little boards where they connect everything with the strings, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to place that, if the strings you're going to connect are naturalistic ones, how are you going to sort of like what's your theory as to what actually happened?
Well, I mean, I think that the followers of Jesus genuinely believed that he was the Messiah. They probably were not expecting him to really die because it seems to me that the actual prophecies were saying was not that the Messiah was going to die. It seems like everybody thought that Jesus was going to rule on the throne of David, usher in the kingdom of heaven, and they had a certain kind of setup. They genuinely believed that this guy was doing miracles, that he was the Son of God, that he was the Messiah, the King of the Jews, whatever. He had a bunch of followers that believed in him. When he died, they were confronted with this existential crisis of, was there some way to adapt their belief system to what had just happened, or were they just going to forget about everything that they had believed before? And I think that historically, we generally see cults, people in cults, adapting their beliefs. So I don't know if somebody actually thought that they saw Jesus, or if they just thought that he would be coming back to usher in this kingdom of God and fulfill his promises and prophecy and all that. I don't know how that happened. I don't know if there was a tomb for there to be an empty tomb. Again, if there was, it's not difficult to think that somebody had taken the body from the tomb. That person did not have to be one of the disciples. The disciples could have then seen that empty tomb and then have thought, okay, well, Jesus resurrected in some way, or he's not still dead. I mean, there are so many explanations. I'm not going to pretend like I have some sort of narrative where this is the way that I think it happened, because again, I don't know how it really happened. But just from all of the historical examples we have for cults, cult members, um, like how religions have developed, or these various supernatural claims, even outside of religion, there's nothing that seems special about the resurrection story in comparison with all of those that makes me think, well, here we have a confluence of evidence that would make me think that the resurrection is actually what happened. I just am not getting to that point.
I mean, I suppose for me, um, so the belief that like again, just to reference the paper that I've been relying on a bit, it sort of comes down to one of two. There are technically other possibilities, but it kind of does come down to one of two possibilities, right? That either, yes, you have the resurrection, or you have that series of false memories and hallucinations, right? As well as, but like each and every single physicalist, I guess you could
Again,
say, or
I didn't say
materialist.
anything about hallucinations or false memories.
Yeah, I know. I'm just going by the paper, right?
Okay.
Um, that a lot of those theories sort of miss, like there's like a piece of evidence that it just can't quite work with, if that makes sense. So um, yeah, I don't know. I guess if for me, if you have no trouble believing that such a thing is possible, and I just sort of fundamentally believe that anything's possible unless it's logically contradictory, or it violates the law of uh, conservation, which I believe is logically contradictory, um, violating it, not the law itself. I mean, or if like if I can observe that it's possible, and I mean I mean seen that people have come back to life. I just have to believe that God was involved, and that I guess we didn't really get into it, but I suppose, I mean, I do believe in God as well. Like the resurrection of Jesus Christ itself, I suppose, could convince you that there is a God, but that's not what it was for me, at least personally. Um, but I guess, yeah, I just have no trouble believing in that this happened.
Okay. Well,
Let me put it this way. Let me put it this way.
okay.
If there is a God, or if there's any religion that is true, I would say that what we have here is the reason why Christianity is more likely to be true than any other religion, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, I'm not gonna get into that can of worms because we are over 2 hours at this point. So if
Mhm.
you're comfortable with that, with leaving it there, I think that that was kind of a good summation of both of our positions there at the end. So yeah, if there's anything else that you wanted to add, I thought it was a good conversation. We didn't need any strict moderation. We could just have a cool adult conversation about these things, and I thought that we were able to cover quite a lot of ground actually, and it was a good conversation overall. So, is there any
Mhm.
other comments that you want to leave us with?
No, I mean, I agree. I think that conversation went well. I enjoyed talking about it, and yeah, I think it was a good, productive discussion. Yeah.
Cool. Well, in if we're gonna wrap it up there, thank you everyone for watching. I appreciate all of the. It was a very lively chat, which I thought was great to see. It's been a minute since I've done a live stream, so I appreciate everyone that pulled through. And yeah, like I said, I'm trying to hit that 1,000 subscribers. So if you could, uh, like and subscribe. I appreciate all of you very much, and I hope that everyone keeps learning. So, uh, for those of you that want to see my next debate, I'm going to be on Modern Day Debates on December 23rd. They asked me if I would like to do a debate on abiogenesis, the origin of life, which is one of my favorite topics. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, right here, Max was asking. That would be December 23rd. So mark it on your calendars. Should be a pretty fiery one because it's going to be a 2v2 with Sal Cordova, who I've debated before and who personally hates my guts. So we'll see. We'll see how that one goes. Should be make for a fun time and a fun debate. So until then, Thank you, Aiden, for joining me for this discussion. Thanks, everyone that watched it live. And yeah, stay learning, stay curious. Grayson out.